Cassette 7, first side. After death. Life is a continuous process without conceivable beginning or conceivable end. This is one of the key ideas of esotericism. We are, however, so familiar with the apparent endings and beginnings of all existent things that without being given the idea and much explanation, we cannot conceive of anything being endless. In the cassettes preceding this one and those which follow, we have been and will be at pains to demonstrate and make reasonable the eternally continuing process of life, with its successive periodic and certainly terminable manifestations, particularly at our objective physical level. This coming and going is according to the cyclic and alternating character of universal law, dealt with in the previous cassette, number 6. Behind the scenes of existence is that which endures forever. It is thought of as the absolute. It is something which for thinking purposes is postulated as an indispensable necessity behind any kind of existence, but which itself is quite beyond the range or reach of thought. It is an ever-enduring, unchanging principle, outside of space and time. Against this background, periodically, in time periods so great that our minds boggle trying to conceive them, the One, the Father, Mother of all existence, wakes and sleeps. Its days of waking are periods when universes manifest, come into and remain in existence for an allotted time and then disappear from the stage of objective activity. The One, however, waking or sleeping, always is. From this One, by stages, emerge all that comprise a universe, by way of the hierarchies of beings, the elements, the tattvas, the various forces and energies which bring into being and sustain everything in cosmos, until the time for withdrawal back into the One comes round again, and so on everlastingly. What is behind this stupendous cyclic activity we will discuss later. A key to understanding is in ourselves, in man. As it is above, so it is below, and the converse is true. If we understand the total life cycle of a human being, we will, by analogy, have some understanding of the cosmic life cycle. In cassette 2, we dealt with the constitution of man and cosmos, the one reflecting the other. We saw that a man, and likewise cosmos, is 7-principled. These 7 principles, however, constitute a whole being, not 7 beings. We saw that they could be grouped in a number of ways. 1, where the 3 upper principles constitute the persisting element of man's being, and the 4 lower ones make up his ephemeral personal being. Let us look again more particularly at these principles to refresh our memories about their nature and function. First, we said that the 3 higher principles constitute a 3-in-1 group, the upper triad, which we called the individuality or ego. It is a combination of manas in its higher aspects and buddhi and atma. In other words, principles 5, 6, and 7. Manas is mind, a dual principle, with a higher and lower aspect. Buddhi is the universal vehicle of universal spirit, Atma. Both Buddhi and Atma, being universal principles, can only be regarded as human when they are, so to speak, focused in manas, the individual mind of man. Next we saw that the lower aspects of manas, in association with kama, K-A-M-A, the desire principle, constitute a middle duad. This is half of principle 5 and all principle 4. Then there's a lower triad, comprising the life or pranic principle, the astral body or double, and lastly the physical body, principles 3, 2, and 1. It is as well to learn this numbering of the principles, as it is used throughout the original literature, and many explanations, particularly those of the after-death states, are given in terms of it. Any other numeration applied to these explanations would not make sense. Atma and Buddhi, taken together and regarded in their universal aspect, are known as monad, and sometimes as jiva, J-I-V-A, the universal life principle. Manas is an individualized unit of Mahat, M-A-H-A-T, the universal mind principle, or divine ideation. Mahat is the totality of mental potential, and can in no particular be exceeded by a human mind. As we saw in cassette 2, the higher part of manas in association with the monad is regarded as the reincarnating or higher ego. This triad is sometimes known as the divine or essential man. As a spark of the universal self, it is sometimes referred to as man's higher self. But HBB suggests the word self should be reserved for Atma alone. Regarding what the ordinary man feels himself to be, he has first a sense of I-ness, referred to in the literature as ahamkara, A-H-A-M-K-A-R-A. This sense of I persists throughout his life. It is a continuing thread of daily consciousness, retaining in memory many incidents, some of major events, some of tiny detail, some of scenes, some of feeling, some of taste, some of smells, etc. These constitute the fabric of conscious life. All in them relate to the past, but the future is anticipated also in terms of them. All these contents of mind are, or arise from, experience, and the experiencer is the man, the entity, the person. And there's a very close identity between the person and the experience. This is because virtually all his experience is gained through the personal self. In terms of our classification, it's hard for a person to realize that except for his inherent sense of I-ness, he is never, or very seldom, aware as or of his ego, his divine self. This is because his means of perception and action, his personal self, cannot consciously, as yet, function at egoic level. If he could, and to the extent that he could, he would become a divine being. Another point we must make, which is relevant to our consideration of the after-death states, is that when we are awake, we are not only conscious of ourselves as separate from other selves, but we are conscious of our surroundings, possessions, relatives, and friends. We must notice now something important. It is that we can be aware of objective things and that we can share that awareness with others. They can see and sense the same things that we do. To this extent, we have an agreed common reality. What about the after-death states? Who knows about them so as to be able to tell us? HPB's two masters claim to have been made to experience these states for themselves. This they learned to do by functioning consciously on the inner planes. They have therefore been able to come back and tell us. The interesting thing about their account is that it is consistent with the mass of all their other teaching. There are other informed accounts of the after-death states in classical literature, but these are veiled and partial, whereas the masters told us in explicit terms and considerable detail, in plain language. It also appears, as far as principles are concerned, to be complete. There is no other similar extant account available. The account is given in the Mahatma letters to A.P. Sinnett, with supplementary material in HPB's collected writings. The account is unique and had never been made public before. The story, as it is told, is that of the case of an average man having lived his allotted span, dying from natural causes. This is the normal condition. Then a number of complications and exceptions are dealt with. Together with the after-death processes, we are given much incidental information about spiritualistic phenomena, which are discussed in Cassette 11. The masters tell us the story both from the point of view of the subject, the deceased, and from a technical angle. The process of dying and of what happens to us afterwards is a long and complicated one, of which the death of the physical body is only a part, albeit the most important part for those left behind. The account begins before death has really occurred, in the last few minutes of life. Before the brain dies, the dying person retains or regains consciousness and reviews in detail the life just ending. Memory dislodges every incident, and everything is seen objectively in its proper perspective as it affected the dying person, and he or she is sensible of his or her reactions to it. The dying one sees himself as he really was, not as he had become accustomed to see or think of himself. This is the moment of truth, as far as the past life is concerned. Trains of thought are set going, and we are told that these last reflections cast their shadows, so to speak, on the next personality. For this reason, they are important, and the masters say that every effort should be made not to disturb this review. When this review, which strikes the keynote for the next incarnation, is completed, consciousness is extinguished. The masters describe it as like the snuffing out of a candle flame. The deceased in the normal case then stays unconscious for a period in Kamaloka. There is a statement in the secret doctrine to the effect that the consciousness is on this plane at the moment of death or in exceptional visions, this plane being that of the auric envelope. This is a quotation from Secret Doctrine, 3rd volume, page 554. And it goes on to say, here is the consciousness of the drowning man when he remembers all the past incidents of his life in a flash. The memory of this consciousness must be stored in the heart, the seat of buddhi. And for a confirmation of that, see also Collected Writings, Vol. 12, page 662. Although it's not specifically mentioned in theosophical literature, there is now evidence not only confirming the review of the past life, but also adding that the dying person may become conscious of an impressive, intimate, powerful presence, which some have likened to deity. This is often seen as a light, a holy light, even as a luminous being. Such is the testimony of people who have been pronounced clinically dead, but who, in fact, recovered to tell the tale. These accounts are in a book by Dr. Moody called Life After Life. The impression of this body of light would be that of one's own ego. Some of the patients had supplementary experiences. They sensed some kind of barrier ahead. They felt as being in a tunnel or as having to cross a valley into light ahead, and so on. We should remember that those who had these experiences were not, in fact, dead. Maybe the crossing of the barrier or coming out into the light would have meant the moment of real death. The experience made a great impression. Those who told of it said they saw that life was for learning, and that all relationships with others must be based on caring and love. To resume our account, having reviewed the life just past, and death having really occurred, the brain having ceased to function, unconsciousness supervenes. For our ordinary person, dying under ordinary conditions, this state persists for maybe only a few hours or for a long time, depending on many factors. It is spent in the Kamaloka, and in exceptional cases, which are mentioned later, there may be some consciousness. When this state is nearly over and before the next one commences, there takes place what is described as a death struggle between the personal and the individuality principles. A separation, so to speak, takes place between the ordinary and the spiritual elements of the previous life experience. It is only the spiritual that can be assimilated by the egoic or spiritual principles, the persisting, reincarnating ones. After this struggle, there follows what is called the gestation state, which can be very long, up to centuries. After the gestation period, consciousness eventually returns to allow another review of the past life. And then occurs what is called the second death, and that is followed by a slow resurgence of consciousness when the deceased enters a state of blissful happiness, undisturbed by any earthly concern or anxiety. The deceased is now in familiar surroundings, among close and familiar relatives, old associates and friends and loved ones. These experiences, we are told, are subjective, but they are just as real, if not more so, than what we call real life. In fact, however, the state is one created from personal memory. It is analogous to a vivid dream, but for the dreamer It is reality. This is the state known in theosophical literature as Devachan, D-E-V-A-C-H-A-N. The Devachani not only has about him or her, in ideal circumstances, all those he or she would most wish to be there, but he experiences also the fulfillment of his higher hopes, aspirations, and noble ambitions. In fact, all that was most worthy of his unfulfilled dreams in his past life. The state is a purely spiritual one, born only of the spiritual content of the past life. It's one of rest. It is an experience of the ego, conditioned and limited by the ex-personality. It is one of recompense for all the ills and pains suffered unjustly in the past life. It corresponds to the dreaming periods during normal sleep. It's a recuperative time between active lives, corresponding to the nights of sleep with their dreams between the days of ordinary physical life. As we have said, the state is a subjective one, and it is private to the dreamer. No one else, however it may seem to the Devachani, can share that experience. There is no reality agreed with others, as there is in earth life. There is no objective reality. There could be no photograph of it to show friends. The whole content of the experience is one of self-created illusion. We are also told quite categorically that in no circumstances can a Devachani return to earth or know anything about what is going on down here. This is because all the vehicles for doing so, the physical body and its inner principles, have disintegrated during the gestation period prior to the return of consciousness in Devachan. There can therefore be no communication either way with earth. Is then no communication possible between someone on earth and someone in Devachan? In the ordinary way, no. Nor can there be any communication through a medium. But some contact can be made at egoic level, if the one left behind can raise his or her consciousness to that level. Whether or not such communion can be brought into physical waking consciousness depends on circumstances which would include the spiritual development of the one on earth, but it would, in the nature of things, be unlikely and uncommon. It would usually be at night when the personal, physical and psychic principles were at rest. HBB says the consciousness of a Devachanic communion can be so impressed on the brain consciousness of the living person as to leave him or her with the strong feeling that he or she has been in touch with the loved one. The experience will at least be of great comfort. As is the case with every other thing or process, this Devachanic phase of the after-death experience comes to an end. Like its dawning, the slow awakening into the state, its end comes gradually, until oblivion overtakes the dreamer and unconsciousness returns. This time forever, as far as the late personality is concerned. The Devachanic period lasts for many earth years, in most cases up to centuries. Eventually, a new cycle starts. The ego begins to invest itself with reformed principles. First, it quickens the psychic and astral principles. Then through these, it eventually makes contact with a suitable new embryonic body. Just before birth, the ego may have a prevision of the main bent of the life to come and what might, perhaps should, be accomplished. Unconsciousness then returns until infant eyes look out upon earth again and a child finds itself born to a certain mother in a certain family living in a certain place in a certain country at a certain time. It is born with certain tendencies, and ahead of it, on its path through life, certain likely major events will be already foreshadowed. All this predetermination is the result of karma. These dictates of karma are the accumulated balance of all that individuality's series of past lives, and not just the immediate one. What we have just described is what happens after a normal average life. But as often as not, there are variations on and exceptions to the rule. The most common variation is premature death, such as happens in accident, death in battle, any death, in fact, where there has not been a full life's experience nor an adequate preparation time for death, such as might have been provided by a long, debilitating illness. For example, in the case of sudden death in childhood, the period in Kamaloka would be very short, and the gestation period, if there were any at all, would also be short. There might be no or very little devachan, because there would have been very little experience to be assimilated. It is in cases like these, we are told, that genuine reincarnation takes place. This happens when, after the death of the child's physical body, the inner principles do not disintegrate. The personality remains intact and only requires another material body, which is often readily available to it in the same family. When premature deaths occur, however, later than in childhood, as for example soldiers meeting sudden death and people being killed in car accidents, the period of immediate unconsciousness can be very short. According to reports from those who were seemingly dead but who recovered, and some reports received from the other side through mediums, such a one may not even realize he is dead. He can't understand why people seem not to see him or not to answer questions when he speaks to them. This condition sooner or later abates, and the processes of death begin to run their course. That is, he becomes unconscious. While such a victim is still in this state of temporary consciousness, he can communicate with those on earth quite rationally for a time through a medium. In the normal case, this can't happen because of the subject's unconsciousness. There are, according to the masters, 3 distinct stages or sub-periods, as the master calls them, in the overall period between death and rebirth. 1, when the ego, delivered of its mortal coil, enters into Kamaloka, the abode of the elementaries, which may last from a few minutes to a number of years. 2, when it enters its gestation state. This is very long, longer sometimes than you may even imagine, yet proportionate to the ego's spiritual stamina. And 3rd, when it is reborn in the Rupaloka of Devachan, and lasts in proportion to the good karma, after which the monad is again reincarnated. That's from the Mahatma Letters, page 105. The initial unconsciousness, mental annihilation, the Master called it, of sub-period 1, that's the period in Kamaloka, lasts from a few hours, rarely less, weeks, months, sometimes to several years. All this according to the entity, to its mental status at the moment of death, to the character of its death. Mahatma Letters, page 186. There's a further description of this state. The good and pure sleep a quiet, blissful sleep, full of happy visions of earth life, and have no consciousness of being already forever beyond that life. And there's more information given us. For example, those who are neither good nor bad will sleep a dreamless, still, a quiet sleep, while the wicked will, in proportion to their grossness, suffer the pangs of a nightmare, lasting years. Their thoughts become living things, their wicked passions real substance, and they receive back on their heads all the misery they have heaped upon others. Reality and fact, if described, would yield a far more terrible inferno than even Dante had imagined. When discussing what happens in premature deaths, for example, suicides, accidents and violence, we were told that in the case first of suicides, although not wholly dissevered from their sixth and seventh principles and quite potent in the seance room, nevertheless to the day when they would have died a natural death, they are separated from the higher principles by a gulf. The sixth and seventh remain passive and negative, whereas in the case of accidental death, the higher and lower groups mutually attract each other. In cases of good and innocent egos, moreover, the latter gravitates irresistibly towards the sixth and the seventh, and thus either slumbers surrounded by happy dreams, or sleeps a dreamless, profound sleep until the hour strikes. With a little reflection and an eye to eternal justice and the fitness of things, you will see why. The victim, whether good or bad, is irresponsible for his death, even if his death were due to some action in a previous life or an antecedent birth. It was an act, in short, of the law of retribution. Still, it wasn't the direct result of an act deliberately committed by the personal ego of that life during which he happened to be killed. Yes, the victims, whether good or bad, sleep to awake but at the hour of the last judgment, which is the hour of the supreme struggle between the sixth and the seventh and the fifth and the fourth, at the threshold of the gestation state. That's from the Mahatma Letters, page 131. The stay in Devachan is enjoyed by everyone, unless they have been so materialistic in life as to deny the possibility of it to themselves, and its length, as we have seen, varies, but we are told it can be many centuries. While in the normal case, consciousness in the first sub-period in Kamaloka can vary between that of deep sleep to pleasant dreams, it can, for others, either very evil or very addicted to carnal desires and pleasures, and especially when death is premature and desires still strong, be a time of conscious suffering, because the lack of a physical body prohibits the satisfaction of the desires. This longing, eventually, sooner or later, according to its strength, wears itself out. The teachings tell us quite specifically that there is no punishment as such after death, apart from these unsatisfied urges, and in some cases remorse for misdeeds. There is no such place or condition as hell, nor for the good is there any such place as heaven. Karma redresses her balances on this earth, in the present or a future life, where our deeds, good or bad, are perpetrated. There is only the compensatory, recuperative, blissful, heavenly stay in Devachan for most of us to look forward to. And then another life on earth, which could be heaven or hell, according to how we live this one now. This is the law of perfect justice in operation, and there's nothing arbitrary about it. On this side of this cassette we have outlined the after-death states from the point of view of the deceased. In the next side we deal with them from an objective point of view as to what happens to us in terms of our principles. Briefly, it is that at death the physical body starts to disintegrate, and with it the astral double, so releasing prana to return to the common pool of jiva. The middle duad, still connected with the upper triad, then spends its period in Kamaloka, from which it enters eventually into the gestation state. During this time the upper triad is slowly withdrawing from it, prior to the triad's entry into Devachan. The middle duad, the karmic and lower monastic principles, then, bereft of the higher principles, become a mere shell, a psychic corpse. This is the elementary, or karma rupa, which, it should be noted, forms only after death, at the end of the gestation period. When the Devachanic period is over, the ex-personality is no more. Its spiritual content has been assimilated into the higher manas of the upper triad, and its personal characteristics as a karmic residue, the essences of the disintegrated lower principles, pass into a dormant state and wait until the ego starts the process of re-embodiment. This involves the substances for the reforming of the inner principles, i.e., the lower fifth, fourth, third, and second. It involves the substances for them being gathered together and organized for attachment to a new physical body. Now, these substances, and therefrom the inner principles, are conditioned by the character of the old principles, which had, so to speak, waited in limbo. In this way, the old personality conditions or becomes the parent of the new one, and another cycle of human life on earth is starting, from where the old one left off. On the first side of this cassette, we discussed the experiences of a deceased person who had died a death from natural causes after a full lifetime. We saw that there are exceptions to this normal case, such as the victims of violence and accident and suicides. On this side, we explain the after-death processes in terms of man's principles and relate them to the larger cosmic scene. The main sources of information are, as we said, the Mahatma letters to A.P. Sinnett and H.P.B's papers to her esoteric school, published in volume 12 of her collected writings, in the third volume of The Secret Doctrine, and in a book called The Esoteric Writings of Madame Blavatsky. These teachings, as given in these works, are not to be found anywhere else. There are numerous accounts of the after-death states from spiritualists, from classical sources, from a number of later theosophical writers, but they all vary, some more, some less, from the Master's version. The latter version demands our respect because it is consistent with the mass of the other occult teaching which they gave out, either directly or through HPB. In order to follow the Master's account, it is therefore necessary to have a working knowledge of their other teachings. As we have said, this is true of any aspect of the teachings. No one part can be understood in isolation from the rest. This is because of the mutual interrelationship and interaction between everything in the total cosmic being. Nothing does or can exist in isolation. To understand the death processes, we must have at least an acquaintance with the common aspects of universal law, with the nature of the planes and the corresponding principles in man's make-up, which were discussed relatively fully in Cassette 2, and with the elements and the elementals dealt with in Cassette 5. Deeper aspects of the story also involve the hierarchies. For example, whence man's principles and faculties and his evolutionary destiny. We have dealt in general terms with the aspects of the law which put the cycle of life and death into the context of the rhythmic overall cosmic process. We have described the various stages of the dying and after-death processes as the deceased experiences them. We told of the review of the past life, of the immediate unconsciousness after death proper, of the period of existence in the Karmaloka, when under some circumstances, mostly exceptional, a degree of consciousness returns, even if it is only a dream. We explained about the death struggle between the egoic triad and the middle duad for the spiritual content of the past life experience. We mentioned the second review of the life recently spent, and then the second death. After this comes the slow return of consciousness with the emergence of the ego into the devachanic state, its happy period of spiritualized bliss. This is followed by a period of unconsciousness, then a preview of the general tenor of the life to come, prior to the birth in a new body. During the first review of the past life, all the person's principles are intact. The moment of actual death comes with the withdrawal of all the inner principles from the body, irrevocably. This is marked by what has come to be known as the severing of the silver cord, said to attach the astral body, and through it all the remaining principles, to the physical body. The physical body, the first principle then, for lack of its unifying coordinating principles, disintegrates, and with it the astral body, the second principle, liberating the vital third principle, prana. We are all aware of the time taken for bodies, that is the physical, and with it the astral, to decay. During this process, no consciousness attaches to them. The departure of principles 1, 2, and 3 leaves only the middle duad, principle 4 and the lower part of the fifth, and the spiritual triad. In the early stages of this separation, the deceased, as we saw, having been immediately unconscious, enters the Karmalokic condition, where it sleeps its Akashic sleep, This is the first of the after-death sub-periods and lasts from a few hours to several years. Then starts the death struggle between the duad and the triad for the spiritual content of the life just past. And this is followed by the gestation period, during which, to use the master's simile, the egoic butterfly is forming in the karma-monastic chrysalis. At the end of this gestation period, there is the second review of the past life, followed by what they called the second death, when the butterfly, the upper triad, emerges from its carapace, the middle duad. At this stage, the middle duad principles, the fourth and lower part of the fifth, become a 1.5 principled shell, bereft of its higher principles. As in the case of the physical and astral bodies, this shell, when the higher principles have left it, starts to disintegrate. This process can, according to HBB, take up to about 30 years. And during this time, it has a mere residual consciousness and memory. As we have seen, at the end of the gestation period, and after the second review and the second death, the ego slowly regains consciousness in the devachan. Eventually, in the normal case, after a long time, this consciousness fades and the processes of rebirth start. Such is a brief summary of what happens when we die, and it might appear somewhat clinical and too objective. Let us see, however, the descriptions of some of these phases of the after-death state or of the between lives period in the Master's more feeling language. The review of the past life and the thoughts this provokes are described in answer to a question, but do the thoughts on which the mind may be engaged at the last moment necessarily hinge onto the predominant character of its past life? The reply was, it can't be otherwise. The experience of dying men by drowning or other accidents brought back to life has corroborated our doctrine in almost every case. Such thoughts are involuntary. We have no more control over them than we would have over the eye's retina to prevent it perceiving the color which affects it most. At the last moment, the whole life is reflected in our memory and emerges from all the forgotten nooks and corners, picture after picture, one event after the other. That impression and thought, which was the strongest, naturally becomes the most vivid and survives, so to say, all the rest. Then there's an interesting statement. No man dies insane or unconscious. Even a madman or one in a fit of delirium tremens will have his instant of perfect lucidity at the moment of death. There's a passage urging those in the death chamber not to disturb this review. In their words, lest you disturb the quiet ripple of thought and hinder the busy work of the past, casting its reflection upon the veil of the future. That's from Mahatma Letters, page 170. The Master was questioned as to how that impression and thought which was strongest naturally becomes the most vivid and survives, so to say, all the rest. He was asked whether this would make for devachanic monotony. Very true, says the Master. That moment lasts from the first to the last. But then it lasts but as the keynote of the whole harmony, a definite tone of appreciable pitch around which cluster and develop in progressive variations of melody, and as endless variations on a theme, all the aspirations, desires, hopes, dreams, which, in connection with that particular moment, had ever crossed the dreamer's brain during his lifetime. without ever having found their realization on earth, and which he now finds fully realized in all their vividness in Devachan, without ever suspecting that all that blissful reality is but the progeny begotten by his own fancy, the effects of mental causes produced by himself. That particular one moment, which will be most intense and uppermost in the thoughts of his dying brain at the time of dissolution, will of course regulate all the other moments. Still, the latter, minor and less vivid though they be, will be there also, having their appointed plan in this phantasmagoric marshalling of past dreams, and must give variety to the whole. No man on earth but has some decided predilection, if not a domineering passion. No person, however humble and poor, often because of all that, but indulges in dreams and desires, unsatisfied though these be. Is this monotony? Mahatma Letters, page 192. Sometimes an image of a person just dead will appear even at a distance to someone he or she loved. The Master explains, his Mayavirupa may often be thrown into objectivity, as in the cases of apparitions after death. But unless they are projected with the knowledge of, whether latent or potential, or owing to the intensity of the desire to see or appear to someone shooting through the dying brain, the apparitions will be simply automatical. Mahatma Letters 129. Concerning the onset of unconsciousness at the moment of death, the Master says, every just disembodied fourfold entity, whether it died a natural or a violent death from suicide or accident, mentally sane or insane, young or old, good, bad or indifferent, loses at the instant of death all recollection. It is mentally annihilated. It sleeps its Akashic sleep in the Kamaloka. Mahatma Letters 187. The next stage, the death struggle, is described as follows. Thenceforth it is a death struggle between the upper and lower dualities. If the upper wins, the sixth, having attracted to itself the quintessence of good from the fifth, its nobler affections, its saintly, though they be earthly, aspirations, and the most spiritualized portions of its mind, follows its elder, divine elder, the seventh, into the gestation state. And the fifth and fourth remain in association as an empty shell. The expression is quite correct. To roam in the earth's atmosphere with half the personal memory gone and the more brutal instincts fully alive for a certain period. An elementary, in short. This is the angel guide of the average medium. If, on the other hand, it is the upper duality which is defeated, then it is the fifth principle that assimilates all that there may be left of personal recollection and perceptions of its personal individuality in the sixth. Mahatma Letters, page 103. In this case, we are told, this personal individuality, having been divorced from monad, it will not remain in Kamaloka. Later on it says, this lost personal life becomes as a torn-out page in the great book of lives. Mahatma Letter 103. The Master explains that this is a rare occurrence. HPV adds something significant here for those who believe in a persistence of consciousness in these after-death periods. She says, but the process of stripping off the lower, the fourth and part of the fifth principles, is an unconscious one in all normal human beings. Otherwise, in very exceptional cases. That's from Collected Writings, Vol. 9, 164. Then the Masters, reviving consciousness begins after the struggle in Kamaloka at the door of Devachan, and only after the gestation period. Mahatma Letters, page 199. Occasionally, HPB refers to the middle duad, which includes the lower mental principle, as Antakarana. We described this in cassette 2. Concerning its part in the after-death processes, we saw that it slowly disintegrates, and she says, at death the Antakarana, is destroyed as a path or medium of communication, and its remains survive as Kamarupa, the shell. It is this which spiritualists sometimes see appearing in the seance rooms as materialized forms, which they foolishly mistake for the spirits of the departed. So far is this from being the case that in dreams, though Antakarana is there, the personality is only half awake. Therefore, Antakarana is said to be drunk or insane during our normal sleep state. If such is the case during the periodical death or sleep of the living body, one may judge what the consciousness of Antakarana is like when it has been transformed after the eternal sleep into Kamarupa. That's from SD 3521. In view of much that we read about activity in the astral body in sleep and after death, the above passage is interesting, especially when we remember that the astral double in the Master's classification disintegrates along with the physical body. What then could what is commonly described as astral activity be? We discuss this on cassette 11. As we saw, after the gestation period there's a second review of the past life before the entry into Devachan. And the Master says that remembrance will return slowly and gradually towards the end of the gestation to the entity or ego, still more slowly, but far more imperfectly and incompletely to the shell, and fully to the ego at the moment of its entrance into Devachan. And now the latter, being a state determined and brought by its past life, the ego does not fall headlong, but sinks into it gradually and by easy stages. With the first dawn of that state appears that life, or rather is once more lived over by the ego, from its first day of consciousness to its last. From the most important down to the most trifling event, all are marshalled before the spiritual eye of the ego. Only, unlike the events of real life, those of them remain only that are chosen by the new liver, pardon the word, clinging to certain scenes and actors. These remain permanently, while all the others fade away to disappear forever, or to their creator, the shell. Now try to understand this highly important, because so highly just and retributive law in its effects. Out of the resurrected past, nothing remains but what the ego has felt spiritually, that was evolved by and through and lived over by his spiritual faculties, be they love or hatred. Mahatma Letters 187. Then a very pertinent question. Who goes to Devachan? The personal ego, of course, but beatified, purified, holy. Every ego, the combination of the sixth and seventh principles, which after the period of unconscious gestation is reborn into the Devachan, is of necessity as innocent and pure as a newborn babe. The fact of his being reborn at all shows the preponderance of good over evil in his old personality. And while the karma of evil steps aside for the time being to follow him in his future earth reincarnation, he brings along with him but the good karma of his good deeds, words and thoughts into this devachan. Bad is a relative term for us, as you were told more than once before, and the law of retribution is the only law that never errs. Hence, all those who have not slipped down into the mire of unredeemable sin and bestiality go to the devachan. They will have to pay for their sins, voluntary or involuntary, later on. Meanwhile, they are rewarded, receive the effects of the causes produced by them. Of course, it is a state, one so to say, of intense selfishness, during which an ego reaps the reward of his unselfishness on earth. He is completely engrossed in the bliss of all his personal earthly affections, preferences and thoughts, and gathers in the fruit of his meritorious actions. No pain, no grief, nor even the shadow of a sorrow comes to darken the bright horizon of his unalloyed happiness. For it is a state of perpetual maya. Mark my letters, page 100. The Master stresses the impossibility of fully describing the devachan state, which he says can be as little described or explained by giving a however minute and graphic description of the state of one ego taken at random, as all the human lives collectively could be described by the life of Napoleon or that of any other man. There are millions of various states of happiness and misery, emotional states, having their source in the physical as well as the spiritual faculties and senses, and only the latter surviving. Mahatma Letters, page 187. The Master then gives some examples of how the state can vary with individuals according to their nature, the background to their personal lives, their desires, and so on. An honest labourer will feel differently from an honest millionaire. Miss Nightingale's state will differ considerably from that of a young bride who dies before the consummation of what she regards as happiness. The two former love their families, the philanthropist humanity. The girl centres the whole world in her future husband. The melomanic knows of no higher state of bliss and happiness than music, the most divine and spiritual of arts. Mahatma Letter, page 188. There are various degrees of devachan, and each merges into the other by insensible gradations. Devachan is a realm or state of effects, the result of subjective activity, aspirations, and so on. The Master distinguishes two fields of causal manifestation, to wit, the objective and the subjective. So, the grosser energies, those which operate in the heavier or denser conditions of matter, manifest objectively in physical life, their outcome being the new personality of each birth included within the grand cycle of the evoluting individuality. The moral and spiritual activities find their sphere of effects in devachan. For example, the vices, physical attractions, etc., say of a philosopher, may result in the birth of a new philosopher, a king, a merchant, a rich Epicurean, or any other personality whose make-up was inevitable from the preponderating proclivities of the being in the next preceding birth. Bacon, for instance, whom a poet called the greatest, wisest, and meanest of mankind, might appear in his next incarnation as a greedy money-getter with extraordinary intellectual capacities. But the moral and spiritual qualities of the previous Bacon would also have to find a field in which their energies could expand themselves. Devachan is such a field. Hence, all the great plans of moral reform, of intellectual and spiritual research into abstract principles of nature, all the divine aspirations, would, in Devachan, come to fruition. And the abstract entity, previously known as the Great Chancellor, would occupy itself in this inner world of its own preparation, living, if not what one would call conscious existence, at least a dream of such realistic vividness that none of the life realities could ever match it. And this dream lasts until karma is satisfied in that direction. The ripple of force reaches the edge of its cyclic basin, and the being moves into the next area of causes. Mahatma Letters, page 191. Regarding the question of punishment after death, we are told that there is none. Our bad karma being visited upon us in the physical world where it was created. But the following is interesting. But if my ego can, after the destruction of my body, become plunged in a state of unconsciousness, then where can be the punishment for the sins of my past life? This was answered. Our philosophy teaches that karmic punishment reaches the ego only in its next incarnation. After death it receives only the reward for the unmerited sufferings endured during its past incarnation. That's from the Key, chapter 9. There is more about the question of reward and punishment, justified by the overall principles involved, as follows. Death comes to our spiritual selves even as a deliverer and friend. For the materialist, who, notwithstanding his materialism, was not a bad man, the interval between lives will be like an unbroken and placid sleep of a child, either entirely dreamless or filled with pictures, of which he will have no definite perception, while for the average mortal it will be a dream as vivid as life and full of realistic bliss and visions. Another question. Then the personal man must always go on suffering blindly the karmic penalties which the ego incurred. Answer, not quite so. At the solemn moment of death, every man, even when death is sudden, sees the whole of his past life marshalled before him in its minute details. For one short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego. But this instant is enough to show him the whole chain of causes which have been at work during his life. He feels and knows the justice of all the suffering that has overtaken him. Does this happen to everyone? Answer, without exception. Very good and holy men see, we are taught, not only the life they are leaving, but several preceding lives in which were produced the causes that made them what they were in the life just closing. They recognize the law of karma in all its majesty and justice. Another question, is there anything corresponding to this before rebirth? There is. As the man at the moment of death has a retrospective insight into the life he has led, so at the moment he is reborn onto earth, the ego, awakening from the state of Devachan, has a prospective vision of the life which awaits him, and recognizes all the causes that have led to it. He realizes them and sees futurity, because it is between devachan and rebirth that the ego regains his full monastic consciousness and re-becomes, for a short time, the God he was, before, in compliance with the karmic law, he first descended into matter and incarnated in the first man of flesh. The golden thread sees all its pearls and misses not one of them. This extract introduces us to the processes of coming back into earth life again. It is the dying process in reverse. Soul principles, the lower fifth, the fourth, second and third, and finally the first, our physical body, are, so to say, reformed. In the case of the soul principles, even the life atoms, which previously composed them, are reassembled. Under what impulses is this process started and conducted? It's explained in the Collected Writings, Volume 10, page 174, that karma, tana, and skandhas are the almighty trinity in one, the cause of our rebirth. The illustration of painting our own likeness at death, and that likeness becoming the future personality, is very poetical and graphic, but we claim it as an occult teaching. At the solemn moment of death, no man can fail to see himself under his true colours, and no self-deception is of any use to him any longer. And thence the following thing happens. As at the instant of drowning, man sees marshalled past his mind's eye the whole of his life, with all its events, effects, and causes, to the minutest details. So, at the moment of death, he sees himself in all his moral nakedness, unadorned by either human flattery or self-adulation, and as he is. Hence, as he, rather as his astral double combined with his karma principle, shall be. For the vices, defects, and especially the passions of the preceding life become, through certain laws of affinity and transference, the germs of the future potentialities in the animal soul, the kama rupa. Hence of its dependent, the astral double, the linga sharira, at a subsequent birth. It is the personality alone which changes. The real incarnating or reincarnating principle, the ego, remains always the same. And it is karma that guides the idiosyncrasies and prominent moral traits of the old personality that was, and that the ego knew not how to control, to reappear in the new man that will be. These traits and passions pursue and fasten on the yet plastic third and fourth principles of the child, and, unless the ego struggles and conquers, they will develop with tenfold intensity and lead the adult man to his destruction, for it is they who are the tools and weapons of the karmic law of retribution. Thus, our good and bad actions are the only tools with which we paint our likeness at death, for the new man is invariably the son and progeny of the old man that was. That's from Collected Writings, Vol. 10, page 176. How are our characteristics and tendencies, our skandhas, transferred from one personality to the next? Well, we are told the following. The latter, that is occultism, teaches that A, the life atoms of our prana, life principle, are never entirely lost when a man dies. That the atoms best impregnated with the life principle, an independent, eternal, conscious factor, are partially transmitted from father to son by heredity, and partially are drawn once more together and become the animating principle of the new body in every new incarnation of the monads. And B, as the individual soul is ever the same, so are the atoms of the lower principles, body, its astral or life double, etc., drawn as they are by affinity and karmic law always to the same individuality in a series of various bodies, etc., etc. That's from the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 671. There are other explanatory passages which help us to get a more complete picture of the after-death processes. In its pure state, the ego would have no personal identity, so that in Devachan it would not relate to the last personality unless there was a means of it so doing. We are told that in the case of the Devachanic entity, the ego, in order to be able to go into a state of bliss as the I of its immediately preceding incarnation, has to be clothed, metaphorically speaking, with the spiritual elements of the ideas, aspirations, and thoughts of the now disembodied personality. Otherwise, what is it that enjoys bliss and reward? Surely not the impersonal ego, the divine individuality. Therefore, it must be the good karmic records of the deceased, impressed upon the auric substance, which furnish the human soul with just enough of the spiritual elements of its ex-personality to enable it to still believe itself that body from which it has just been severed, and to receive its fruition during a more or less prolonged period of spiritual gestation. For Devachan is a spiritual gestation within an ideal matrix state, a birth of the ego into the world of effects, which ideal subjective birth precedes its next terrestrial birth, the latter being determined by its bad karma into the world of causes. There's a footnote which explains that here the world of effects is the Devachanic state and the world of causes, earth, life. And the quotation continues. In the case of the spook, the Kamarupa is furnished from the animal dregs of the auric envelope, with its daily karmic record of animal life, so full of animal passions and desires and selfish aspirations. SD 3495. The story goes on to tell us what happens when an ego, its Devachanic period completed, starts the process of rebirth. As follows. Now, the Linga Sharira remains with the physical body and fades out along with it. An astral entity, then, has to be created, a new Linga Sharira provided to become the bearer of all the past tanas and future karma. How is this accomplished? The mediumistic spook, the departed angel, fades out and vanishes also in its turn as an entity or full image of the personality that was, and leaves in the karmalokic world of effects only the record of its misdeeds and sinful thoughts and acts, known in the phraseology of the occultists as tanic or human elementals. Entering into the composition of the astral form of the new body into which the ego, upon its quitting the Devachanic state, is to enter according to karmic decrees, the elementals form that new astral entity which is born within the auric envelope, and of which it is often said, bad karma waits at the threshold of Devachan with its army of skandhas. For no sooner is the Devachanic state of reward ended than the ego is indissolubly united with, or rather follows in the track of, the new astral form. Both are karmically propelled towards the family or woman from whom is to be born the animal child, chosen by karma to become the vehicle of the ego, which has just awakened from the devachanic state. Then the new astral form, composed partly of pure akashic essence of the auric egg, and partly of the terrestrial elements of the punishable sins and misdeeds of the last personality, is drawn into the woman. Once there, nature models the fetus of flesh around the astral, out of the growing materials of the male seed in the female soil, and thus grows out of the essence of the decayed seed the fruit or eidolon of the dead seed, the physical fruit producing in its turn within itself another and other seeds for future plants. That's a quotation from SD 3496. An interesting passage tells us that death has not always been the lot of humankind, and presumably, as evolution goes full circle, there will come a time again when we shall not be subject to it. Here is the passage. It is of this earth or new continent that Zarathustra became the lawgiver and ruler. This was the fourth race in its beginning, after the men of the third began to die out. Till then, there had been no regular death, but only transformation, for men had no personality as yet. They had monads, breaths of the one breath, and as impersonal as the source from which they proceeded. They had bodies, or rather shadows of bodies, which were sinless, hence karmaless, or karmaless. Therefore, as there was no karmaloka, least of all nirvana or even devachan, for the souls of men who had no personal egos, there could be no intermediate periods between the incarnations. Like the phoenix, primordial man resurrected out of his old into a new body. Each time, and with each new generation, he became more solid, more physically perfect, agreeably with the evolutionary law, which is the law of nature. And death came with the complete physical organism, and with it moral decay. That was from Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, page 610. It should be noted particularly that this account of the after-death states and the reincarnation processes accords with all that we have been told about the constitution of man and cosmos, about the astral light, the law in its cyclic and retributive aspects, and with the continuity of the life process. None of the other accounts of the spiritualists and others are so complete, nor do they fit with all aspects of the esoteric science. For example, it's commonly believed that communication with disembodied spirits is possible, and that there is much evidence which seems to support this view. Our account rules this out, and such possibility or otherwise will be discussed on cassette 11. What principally distinguishes this account from others is the clear statement about what it is that reincarnates, the ego, and not the person. When a person dies, that person never, except in very premature deaths, reincarnates. The personal elements of the total man which survive death are only those factors, the skandhas, which as the accumulated result or effects of the previous personal life become the causative conditioning factors in the succeeding personal life, the new objective man or woman. The ego is the persisting entity, the connecting thread, so to speak, between one life and the next. It is the seat of the individual consciousness of each person in the chain. But the bulk content of consciousness of each life is derived from that life's experience. The egoic levels can only be sensed in transcendent spiritual experience, or maybe in the gentle promptings of real conscience. The great lesson to be learned from these teachings is that we are making our next personality now. Everything we think, say, and do affects that new person, absolutely, inevitably, and inexorably. This is the law, and it is perfectly just, and in the long run, perfectly merciful. We have as many opportunities to make good as we can possibly want. This is the end of the second side of Cassette 7.